Okay, so everyone, thank you so much for being here. Lily and Gabriela, thank you so much. So I'm going to start with an introduction of what JSET is. So JSET, or just Socio-Ecological Transitions in Latin America, starting during the fall of 2023, and are co-directed by Andrea and Joe, with the support from a WCNR Dean grant for transdisciplinary approaches to environmental weed problems. One of the primary goals of JSET is to build transdisciplinary community of practice between different actors like faculty members, practitioners, and students working on socio-ecological challenges in Latin America. And during the semester, we are exploring experiences and approaches that address socio-environmental challenges across CSU, other universities, and also different organizations in Latin America. Right now, we are very happy to welcome Dr. Lily House-Peters. She's an associate professor of the Department of Geography, California State University in Long Beach. And she's trained environmental geographer and political ecologist interested in environmental philosophy, climate and environmental justice, natural resource extraction, governance, and conservation policy. And also the role of emerging robotics, smart technologies, and algorithms in producing novel encounters with new understandings of nature. She has 10 years of expertise in capacity building for transdisciplinary action research, and also has conducted research in regions across the Americas and in Oceania, including the US-Mexico borderlands, Australia, and the US West and Southwest regions. And we also welcome Dr. Gabriela Alonso that is an associate professor of the Wharton School of Education in the University of Calgary. Her program of research concerns action-oriented research focused on describing and examining processes of learning and education in the context of sustainability multi-sector partnerships. And she's also interested in understanding the factors and conditions that influence how teams co-produce integrated action-oriented socio-ecological knowledge in networks that include knowledge keepers, local community members, and academics. And she also works in areas such as transdisciplinary and convergence research and critical sustainability. So thank you so much for being here, and now I give you the floor to start with your presentations.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'll begin and then Gabriela will jump in. But today we're going to be talking about our kind of research that led to our edited volume, Converging Boundaries, Transdisciplinary Experiences from Biodiversity Conservation Practices in 3 case study sites in Colombia, Uruguay, and Chile. And then we'll talk a little bit about the book, and then I think leave ample time for kind of conversation questions. We have a few prompts, but also can just have a wider kind of conversation or answer questions. Thank you for the introduction. So I'll just go ahead and move forward. And just to give a sense, this is showing kind of the cover of the book, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. But it's an edited volume, and we have a very broad range of authors, including people from communities, activists, more kind of traditional scholars. But we really felt it was important in this work to get, people's voices in their own voices, since that was a lot of kind of what we did in this research, which I'll talk about here in a moment. And then our cases being, we'll go into this a little bit, but kind of 3 watersheds, one in central Colombia, the Maipo River Valley in Chile, which is where Santiago sources its water. So a lot of conflicts over those resources. And then the Solis Grande Basin in Uruguay. So just as a little kind of point of departure here, to give you a sense of how we kind of think about transdisciplinary science. So, we're really interested in science that can have actionable possibilities, that can be transformative. And so, in order for that to be possible, we really believe that what counts as knowledge has to expand beyond just, knowledge generated by academics or scientists, the more traditional ways of producing and disseminating knowledge, to include other complex ways of understanding and engaging the world experienced by people and other groups and sectors of society. And so here, our idea then of transdisciplinarity or transdisciplinary science is really this research approach that emphasizes integration across disciplinary fields, but far beyond just that, the kind of authentic inclusion and engagement of non-academic stakeholders, and the production of really context-driven, solutions-oriented knowledge. And kind of as the title of the working group that y'all have, thinking about these wicked problems, we really see, global environmental change, which encompasses climate change, biodiversity conservation, all of these issues. Those are, some of the most wicked problems, and the ways that we've been approaching them or trying to solve them are clearly, have major gaps or are falling short. So how can we think about this in new ways, especially from kind of a science perspective? And another kind of point of departure for us, or way we frame our work is thinking about transdisciplinarity as a way of being, or even as a way of life. And this is drawing on some recent scholarship. And so here we're thinking about, transdisciplinarity as a way of being, inseparable from personal life. It extends beyond our professional, activities just as a researcher, and also really draws our attention to, what are our commitments and responsibilities as researchers, but also of, a various group of actors to be involved in this kind of work. And so, making this more of a mindset or an approach to life rather than just, this is a disciplinary, window or something like that. And so we see this also in our own work has been really important for how it shapes our teamwork, our relationships, building emotional bonds between individuals, and thinking about these different kinds of encounters and moving beyond just a kind of professional into really thinking about building trust, friendship, feelings, emotions, because that's also really important to how people learn, how people, build trust, and then eventually, ideally, how we kind of transform these relationships that aren't working into ones that hopefully can solve problems better for diverse groups. And so this was we had a small grant through the IAI. And if you're not aware of the IAI, they're a really interesting organization. The acronym stands for the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. They previously were in Montevideo. They've just moved their offices up to Panama City, Panama, but they receive funding from the NSF, among other groups, and they also include the Belmont Forum, which is a research organization that does multi-country kind of research around big issues. Right now, Belmont Forum has a call out for funding projects focused on tropical forests, which one like Joel might be interested in, thinking with the Amazon. But they kind of think about big topical issues like the ocean, tropical forests, climate and health, these kinds of, wicked problems and major kind of thematic areas. So we had a small grant with IAI for about 3 years, and that's really what the book kind of comes out of. And that was our small grant, was really thinking about how can we better incorporate local and traditional knowledge in order to generate kind of new insights for ecosystem services, nature-based solutions, and biodiversity conservation at the local scale. So big issues, that we had were really thinking about how do you integrate across, even navigate, let alone, and then integrate across really divergent interests, value systems, and in many cases, even knowledge systems and understanding, of how people understand the world epistemologically, ontologically. And so we really thought a lot about, different governance modalities, but also, just different approaches to research and community building and collaboration that could begin to navigate and integrate across difference, and really thinking about difference and conflict, which we'll get to in a moment, as not just negative things, but actually as productive and potentially very positive and generative of new solutions. But then it's kind of how do you manage these, plural or pluralistic relationships, rather than kind of just taking, one idea and going forward with it. So our project also really grew out of what we saw as a major policy implementation gap happening probably around the world, but in this case, we were focused more specifically on Latin America. And, the policy, what we've seen, and right now, in Cali, Colombia, they're having the big conference of the parties, the COP on biodiversity, and there's, representatives from countries around the world meeting. And so we've seen this major kind of growth in protected area coverage when we think about policy. We've seen that at the global level with big policy, and also at national levels or regional levels that, we must protect biodiversity. But, what we're actually seeing is a massive decline in the abundance of species, a massive decline in biodiversity, and a lot of, growing and often unmitigated threats towards biodiversity. And so, we were thinking, where is this gap happening between all of this policy momentum, but then we're not actually seeing the on the ground, change or transformation that's needed. And so that's, part of what got us really thinking about, well, when you get to the local scale where a lot of these projects are actually being implemented, right, that's where we start to see this gap. And so that was part of kind of the framing for our project, what this work grew out of. And Gabby, do you want to jump in here?
Yep, ready.
Okay, I'll pass the word to you, Gabby, and then I'll jump back in.
Gracias, Lily.
Sí.
So thank you so much, everyone. Really excited to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to Joel and Andrea and Paula that, took the time to make sure everything was working for the technology. I'm going to take on Joel's invitation to speak in Spanish, also because I want to, make this accessible to Jorge Rubiano, who is a community member, director of an organization that we work in Colombia. And I know he might be also with other of the community members we worked in Colombia.
Y es él en la foto.
Exacto, él está en la foto. Bueno, algo importante, voy a hablar un poquito sobre como la parte conceptual de nuestro trabajo y algunas de las ideas que han surgido también en términos conceptuales de cómo mantener la colaboración respetuosa y transdisciplinar con equipos que trabajan en cambio global. Algo que nosotros hemos identificado que es importante, y no somos los primeros en decirlo, es que para que exista un trabajo más horizontal, se requiere lo que le llaman soluciones orientadas a investigación orientada a la solución y en colectividad. Y algunos puntos que nosotros consideramos vitales son que estas discusiones sobre colaboraciones horizontales abren espacios para que se consideren preguntas sobre cómo se genera el conocimiento y cómo se toman decisiones en la elaboración de proyectos. Por supuesto que esto responde a un llamado que es en varios campos, pero nosotros específicamente lo hemos identificado en lo que se llaman servicios ecosistémicos como soluciones por la naturaleza que necesariamente invitan a hacer trabajo en el vínculo de naturaleza y humanidad. Entonces creemos que es un espacio muy fértil ahí para el trabajo transdisciplinar. Y en el último punto pueden leer que algo que nosotros hemos identificado como un impacto o una extensión de esta contribución es en cómo se desarrolla la vida académica. Es una forma de abrir espacios para confrontar inequidades que son persistentes en el trabajo académico y en las prácticas de generación de conocimiento. Es abrir la puerta para otros tipos de entender el mundo y quitar un poco el foco de atención al trabajo académico e intelectual como se considera convencionalmente en universidades. La siguiente, por favor, Lili.
Sí.
Esta foto es muy ilustrativa de uno de los principios del trabajo que nosotros hemos identificado como más efectivos, que es pasarle el micrófono a la gente. Cómo nos movemos de la disciplina a la transdisciplina. Dos puntos importantes, y tenemos un artículo que después compartiremos con ustedes, y que en su mayoría no fue muy bien recibido cuando nosotros escribimos o sugerimos esta aproximación de descentralizar a la academia como les explicaba antes, como mover el foco de atención a los intereses y a la narrativa académica, y más bien darla a la gente de las comunidades o a los actores de espacios locales en donde trabajamos. Y esto implica un trabajo serio de deconstrucción de conocimiento, o como nosotros llamamos, de desaprendizaje, porque pues hemos sido entrenados en términos disciplinarios. eh, Mientras más demostremos expertise en un área disciplinar, mejor evaluados somos y podemos tener mayores opciones de acceso a publicaciones, por ejemplo, y esto es una limitación en el trabajo transdisciplinar porque hace como muy cuadrada la forma de aproximarse a soluciones colectivas. Entonces, eso es un punto que nosotros queremos resaltar y que está muy explícito en el libro. Un siguiente, por favor, Lili. Una del otro principio es los espacios de diálogo, en donde implementamos este proceso de desaprendizaje. Y el proceso de desaprendizaje lo hemos hecho de diferentes maneras. Es interesante que uno se esfuerza a ser creativo en términos de cómo consolidas procesos o actividades que te permitas descentralizar el conocimiento académico y desaprender la, las convenciones epistemológicas de nuestras disciplinas, y lo que hacemos es hacer diálogos, espacios de diálogos donde, por ejemplo, discutimos lo que le llamaríamos en la academia posiciones epistemológicas, afiliaciones metodológicas, y se abre una discusión con actores comunitarios, con miembros de las organizaciones gubernamentales, en donde ellos también comparten qué entienden por metodología, cómo ven el mundo, cuáles son sus prioridades. Entonces eso hace un diálogo, un espacio de diálogo que es muy productivo, muy generativo para centralizar o priorizar intereses que son más relevantes o más significativos para una solución en concreto en esa localidad. Muy feminista, quizá la aproximación lo que define el siguiente paso es la situación particular en ese contexto donde trabajamos. La siguiente, Lili, por favor. Un poco de también otra de las actividades que, como les decía, forzan a los equipos, no solo a nosotros, sino a otros equipos de transdisciplina a ser creativos, es poder encontrar como herramientas de la academia que también nos sirvan para expresar el tipo de trabajo que estamos haciendo. Y uno de las herramientas más útiles que hemos encontrado, y está reportada como también exitosa en trabajo transdisciplinar, es los objetos límite, boundary objects, en realidad boundary work, dos digamos, dos bases fundamentales que le permiten a esta herramienta académica ser útil, es que se refiere a trabajo, se refiere a labor, que es como nosotros vemos el trabajo académico. Y la otra es que nos permite, bueno, ha sido muy efectivo en que sirve para establecer comunicación efectiva en coyunturas disciplinares. Entonces, si vemos personas de diferentes afiliaciones epistemológicas, con diferente entrenamiento, con diferentes prioridades de investigación, cuantitativas, cualitativas. Utilizar objetos límites o identificar palabras que nos permiten hablar de lo mismo, aunque no necesariamente nos estamos refiriendo a lo mismo, pero nos permiten tener un lenguaje común o un modelo mental común, nos ayuda a avanzar el trabajo de colaboración. Ahora, enseguida les presento una estrategia más específica. Sí, la que sigue, Lili. Entonces, lo que hicimos, y esta es una actividad muy, muy bonita y además muy exitosa para nuestro equipo. En el principio del trabajo hicimos un taller en Colombia con la totalidad del equipo, incluyendo los actores comunitarios locales, las personas de la universidad y todo el equipo. Logramos reunirnos en Colombia y hicimos una actividad en la que pedimos bueno, por supuesto que había miembros de los equipos en los 3 países donde estábamos trabajando, y les pedimos que identificáramos términos, nociones, conceptos que ellos consideraban muy significativos para el caso, el estudio de caso que ellos, en el que ellos trabajaban. Entonces, Chile, Colombia y Uruguay, identificamos de 3 a 5, le llamamos keywords o términos muy significativos, y llegamos a la conclusión de que muchos de los términos convergían en nociones o en conceptos relacionados con conflicto, asimetrías de poder y pluralidad. El mapa que ven en el centro es un Social Network Analysis que hicimos para poder identificar efectivamente qué tan relacionados estaban estos conceptos, con una breve descripción relacional, en términos de, más allá de solo decir el término, articular qué significaba esa relación. Entonces, fue muy interesante que llegamos, hubo una consistencia en conflicto, asimetría de poder y pluralidad, y eso nos permitió identificar elementos que son prioridad para los 3 casos. Entonces, no hay un interés comparativo, pero hay un interés de descripción densa. El que sigue, Lili, por. Entonces, bueno, este es otro ejemplo que quisimos compartir con ustedes, que es también la base del libro, en donde nos dimos a la tarea de articular en conjunto estos 3 términos. Entonces ya se imaginarán que sí es un trabajo, voy a decir, muy interesante, fue fascinante y también draining, fue cansado porque es revisar muchas posiciones ideológicas, ¿no? Lili lo comenta muy bien, nuestro trabajo tiene, siempre somos muy explícitos en eso, el equipo habla sobre situaciones incómodas en términos de conversaciones que son complicadas. Y este fue un ejercicio muy productivo y nos llevó bastantes días del taller en el que estuvimos. Ahí está en donde convergen conflicto, pluralidad y asimetrías de poder, y otra foto del taller donde estábamos trabajando. ¿Qué sigue, Lili?
Sí.
Ya, ahora sí, ya te toca.
Okay. And so here we'll just briefly talk a little bit about kind of each of the cases and how they got integrated into the book. And then I have a few on the next kind of slides, kind of just snippets out of the e-version. But in Colombia, you can see here actually some of the local activists and community members. We actually held during COVID. So I should say COVID happened right in the middle of our project. We were actually in that meeting in Bogota, our workshop, and we basically, the world shut down like 3 days later. So that was March 2020. And so Maria, who was a graduate student at the University of at the I guess Universidad Nacional de Colombia in Bogota, along with Jorge and others from Semillas de Agua, helped to organize some writing workshops to actually get people to tell their own stories about the work that they've been doing around watershed protection, territorial defense. There's a large threat from mining in this region, and this is a very important biodiverse region. In Colombia, with also kind of very high level or high altitude parts of the watershed with very significant ecological and biodiversity. They are endemic species. So like the frejolone that you can see in the Semillas de Agua logo there, that kind of only grows in some of these high altitude equatorial Andean areas. So we actually had kind of 19, some cases they were short contributions into the book from Colombia, and some of them were actually poems, as you'll see, photo narratives, autobiographies of people telling their stories of how they have engaged through their life course in this kind of territorial defense and environmental restoration and conservation, drawing attention, to the issues that are happening throughout the watershed, from, mining and those types of threats all the way to kind of urban waste and what it means to, live in the bottom of kind of the watershed where pollution is, accumulating. And so here we really see a lot of demonstration of the importance of traditional ways of knowing collective action, and this, desire to have a much more equitable, inclusive, ways of territory and ways of protecting the ecology. And so there's just a few like snapshots from some of the Colombia chapters, but there's, a mix in this case. And the book, actually, I should say, the chapters are primarily written in Spanish, with the exception of the introduction that we co-wrote as the editors, and the conclusion, those are both in English. And then throughout the book, you'll see in maybe some of the other screenshots with the other cases, we do have these little kind of English summaries in the chapters so that people can engage. But we also really thought it was important for this book to be primarily published in Spanish, because many people who were writing and contributing were writing in Spanish as their kind of native language. And so we didn't want to then kind of overly translate their words. And also, we want this to be a book that is accessible to and usable to scholars in Latin America, and to not have, take the knowledge out of this region, publish it in English, and then, make it more difficult. So for that reason, so in that way, it's been a little bit tricky with the book because it's kind of multilingual, but that was kind of an idea or something we tried out. But you can see here, for example, from Alberto, like, peasants, opening conservation pathways. So really thinking from that and kind of telling a story about, being born in this watershed. Chapter 14, and so these are some of the short ones, thinking about, these pequeños pasos para un gran transformación. So how do we think with, small steps forward that could accumulate into something much bigger? New visions for conservation. And then in the case of chapter 8, that's from Monica Clavijo, who was a graduate student working on our project in Colombia, thinking about this from a little bit more of an academic. This is part of her thesis work. So kind of putting together, this was also part of that kind of decentering academia, or kind of really trying to be transdisciplinary, of putting these voices, next to each other in ways that maybe you wouldn't find, say, in an academic journal that might only be more academic contributions and not necessarily have some of the other ones. And this actually shows here just the beginning of kind of a poem that goes on for some pages, but kind of also telling these stories through poetry or other creative mechanisms for people to express kind of their connection to the area and their work and activism, and how they kind of see themselves as, warriors and defenders of this land. And in Uruguay, you can see here the watershed. This is in kind of southern Uruguay near the Rio Plata. So across from the other side of that map would be Buenos Aires in Argentina. And here we had contributions also from kind of a broad range of authors. There were community leaders, there were staff of an NGO, and then our academic kind of researchers as well. And in this case, we were really looking at a participatory process of creating a protected area in this place called the Arroyo Solis Grande. And so here was also a story of how do you get, in this case, kind of a lot of private landowners and private actors to come together to create this conservation or preservation area. And so we're really looking at some of these drivers that motivate, diverse stakeholders to, overcome what have historically been, difficult or conflict-laden relationships, and be able to participate together in a collective process towards local environmental conservation, and bringing in this case, what private property does to that as well, and how you need to get people to negotiate in these kinds of areas. And so this also thought a lot about plurality and ways of engaging in these systems or areas where you're, not going to probably get people to consensus. So what does that mean then for taking seriously and respecting plurality, but still being able, to move forward and advance goals? And in this case, people brought forward that it's not just the natural protection, but, really having to think with the culture and the cultural goods and services as well. So kind of trying to think about that. And some examples thinking about here this program of doing conservation, in private land, with different authors coming together. And in Chile, just because I want to have some time for conversation, we were looking at the Maipo River watershed. Here you can see obviously the highlands of the Andes before this flows, down into the kind of Great Basin where Santiago is, with a very rapidly growing urban population and a lot of, this almost reminds me a bit, being here in the Southwest, of, the fights we have over the Colorado River, a system that is so important to such a large number of people and uses. And so here we were really looking as well as what have been the impacts associated with the neoliberal water management model that's been implemented in Chile, and what could alternative ecocentric approaches look like, including from, indigenous approaches and activists who, when this research was happening, were involved in drafting what was to be a very progressive kind of model of a constitution for Chile, which did fail the ratification vote. But, getting those views of like, what could a different Chile look like? What could a different orientation to natural resources outside of what has become a very entrenched neoliberal mode of governance, what could be possible? And what if we really change that kind of, epistemology and governance strategies? And so here you can see this is one of our PhD students who just is finishing or defending in Calgary, working actually along with one of the Mapuche, or writing with one of the Mapuche activists who was involved in rewriting the Constitution. So those are just some snippets. There's quite a few chapters in the book, especially because they do vary in length, from, in some cases, just, a few pages of somebody's kind of more autobiographical story or reflections on their work, to, longer, more traditional kind of academic chapters. And just thinking with kind of some key lessons that have come out of this, that, we're really interested, as we said at the beginning, of, how do we get to kind of a transformative, progressive outcomes? How are those achievable? Because we've been seeing how difficult, it is to overcome the models that we find in these areas and the power structures that are there. And how can we kind of really prioritize just and inclusive models of collaboration? And so, our first is really centering and prioritizing the interests of the on-the-ground actors and their modes of organization. That also comes with the decentering of academia, of not walking into the room and just thinking like, well, I have a PhD, so obviously I know everything kind of model that historically we've seen happen. But instead really, as Gabriela was saying, turning the word over, like giving the voice to the community to drive the process, and being there as a listener, as a learner, as a collaborator, but not in this kind of very vertical structure. Second, really thinking about conflict resolution and what that means. And in a lot of cases, it means, difficult and long dialogue that needs to happen between community members, between policy actors, between, researchers, and not just kind of thinking, okay, we're going to try to avoid conflict, hopefully, or any conflict is necessarily bad. So thinking about those types of navigating that. Third, really identifying and taking seriously power dynamics, and, being open to thinking with the community about challenging traditional power structures, and how do you rectify those power imbalances, because that's what we're seeing in many of these cases, that, great power imbalances exist. And then amplifying the voices of women, Indigenous people, and the local communities, especially, when we're thinking about local implementation of policy that's often made at global or national or even regional scales, that might not, I think this is changing a little bit, but it still tends to be very much driven by, the powerful interests, and often leaves out diverse voices. And fifth, recognizing the multiple ways in which these concepts of power, conflict, and plurality really challenge and shape the challenges and opportunities that exist. And so we found it very generative to think with, power, conflict, and plurality as three things that we saw arising out of and kind of connecting across these cases that are otherwise in kind of very geographically disparate parts of the region. And so with that, I'm going to just put up our last slide, which has a few, we're open to any kind of Q&A, but we also came up with just a couple prompts if that's, helpful for people to think with in this last kind of 20 minutes. And I can also stop sharing and put those in the chat if it's easier or whatever.
Thank you so much for this insightful presentation. So now we're going to open the conversation and give the floor to people in the online meeting. Like if you want to give a comment or any question, you can share it through chat or feel free to open your microphone. And also here in the room, if anyone have any comment or question.
Oh.
Ok, gracias.
Hi, Fanny.
Gracias por compartir. Tengo dos preguntas para las dos. Actualmente también estamos trabajando con áreas protegidas y mi interés es sobre el análisis que hicieron sobre las áreas protegidas. ¿Presenta algún contexto especial o cómo escogieron estas áreas protegidas? ¿Con base en qué, en qué elementos? Y la otra es un poco metodológico sobre el social network analysis que hicieron con conceptos. Como quisiera saber qué programas, software usaron y un poco más sobre este análisis también. Gracias.
¿Quieres empezar, Gabriela?
Gracias. ¿Cómo te llamas?
Darío.
Hola, Darío.
Okay.
Bueno, el caso más explícito del establecimiento de área natural protegida es el uruguayo, en Solís Grande, y el caso lo seleccionamos primero por oportunidad. Estábamos colaborando con un grupo ya desde hacía el 2014, que estaba en diálogo para establecer un área comunitaria. Es interesante que el proceso de establecimiento de áreas, las políticas de establecimiento de área natural protegida en Latinoamérica ha caminado del norte al sur. Entonces, lo que en México, las políticas que iniciaron en los 90s y que son discusiones sobre la efectividad de áreas manejadas por el gobierno, apenas llegaban a Uruguay hace como 6 años. Entonces, había una conversación sobre el establecimiento de áreas privadas o áreas establecidas por la comunidad. Y Andrés, el investigador que estaba trabajando con nosotros, nos comentó sobre el trabajo de alianzas que existían, que genuinamente representaba, como dijo Lili, una multitud de voces. Estaba desde las disciplinas de antropología y arqueología, que hay un capítulo en el libro donde estudian la relevancia cultural del sitio, el trabajo de los biólogos y de Facultad de Agropecuarias, como para justificar la validez de la importancia del sitio. Y bueno, toda una conversación sobre cómo se justifica que no sea necesariamente una área establecida por el gobierno, sino por una región muy pequeña, en realidad un grupo de actores muy pequeños. Entonces esa fue la razón por la de Uruguay. Creo que es también importante mencionar que en Colombia, Colombia es un proyecto muy amplio. Está Jorge, no sé si podamos darle la palabra, si él quiere comentar algo sobre el área de protección también de Tolima, pero también hubo una conversación muy interesante sobre el establecimiento de esa área, que es solo un aspecto del trabajo de semillas de agua. Y fíjate, es muy interesante que justo cuando estábamos en el taller, el compañero de Uruguay, pues lo primero que hizo fue hacer network con Jorge porque estaban justo tratando ese tema. Entonces esa es la parte de las áreas naturales protegidas que comentaste. No sé si contesté tu pregunta.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Y luego lo de la metodología, utilizamos UCNet, o sea, Borgatti, la aproximación de Borgatti. Ves que el Social Network Analysis te permite, es en realidad cualitativo, cuantificas eh, datos cualitativos, o sea, cuantificas el número de conexiones que tienen ciertos nodos. En este caso, los conceptos que mencionaron, que eran, como te comentaba, de 3 a 5 por caso, por actor que estábamos ahí, entonces fuera un número pues bastante amplio de conceptos. Escribimos una breve como articular a qué se referían y con eso generamos el mapa. Entonces las convergencias más consistentes fueron en estos 3 conceptos. Había otros, pero fue muy interesante que surgiera eso como esos 3 conceptos en los 3 casos con todos los que estábamos participando de diferentes sectores.
Ya, gracias.
Oh, gracias. Fanny, hola Fanny. Y Fanny, estábamos hablando de Belmont Forum y Fanny trabaja con Belmont Forum. So.
Hola Lili, hola Gaby, qué bueno verlas. Em, Qué interesante el libro, la verdad que hemos conversado varias veces, pero no de los casos que estudiaron, así que muchas gracias por compartir. Yo quería preguntarles sobre el proceso de escribir con la participación de las personas, cómo fue ese proceso y cómo los incorporaron, digamos, a las personas que participaron, a las comunidades, los líderes, en el proceso de escribir no solo el libro, no sé si también se publicaron artículos académicos o quienes escribieron, los autores quiénes son los autores que mostraron en los diferentes textos que veíamos en las diapositivas. Eso, sí, esa es mi pregunta.
Sí, muy interesante. Y no sé si Jorge quiere hablar algo, porque Jorge estaba como en la sala con Mónica y los miembros de las comunidades, las mujeres activistas y todos cuando escribíamos esos.
Sí. Hola, Lili, ¿me escuchas?
Hola, Jorge.
No. ¿Me escuchas? ¿Me escuchan?
Sí.
Oh, ok. Solamente 3 aportes al tema. Uno que nos parece importante es que realmente concebimos desde el proyecto y desde ustedes un interés genuino por los casos, más allá del proyecto. Esa preocupación y profesionalismo con que desarrollaron el trabajo realmente generó aquí un marco de altísimo interés en este tipo de proceso. 2, un resultado del proyecto que fue la tesis de Mónica Clavijo sobre cómo se gesta o se desarrolló los procesos de coproducción en la cuenca del río Coello. Son la base en este momento del fortalecimiento del comité y del proceso de trabajo en la cuenca. Realmente unos insumos muy importantes que derivaron a partir de reflexiones con los diferentes actores. Y 3, las historias de vida que se escribieron fue un proceso, diríamos que casi que terapéutico, ¿cierto? Psicosocial, de cómo comunidades campesinas rurales realmente han enfrentado los desafíos del extractivismo y de desafíos de los modos de producción y que han logrado plasmar en sus historias de vida realmente esos esfuerzos y esas luchas que a veces en este tipo de estrategias son intangibles, ¿cierto? Y que son un ejemplo y que son realmente un insumo muy importante de relato de las luchas a todo nivel en esta región. Por eso nos parece muy importante este tipo de enfoques transdisciplinarios y sobre todo una participación genuina de la comunidad en una interacción realmente bastante propositiva. Eso sería, Lili y compañeros. Muchas gracias por todo.
Gracias, Jorge. Hay una pregunta en el chat from Paul Cisneros, which is asking, well, it's in Spanish, so I'll say in English, but asking about that, we kind of had our point of departure being the implementation, the conservation implementation kind of gap. And so, what is our response to that question, and how does it differ from, more conventional lines of research that have maybe looked at this? And I mean, I think one, we definitely, found that there is a big gap, that, these conventional policies, especially those made without local voices, and especially a multiplicity of local voices, because, even a community itself is going to have many different ideas and a plurality of opinions and values within it. So, even having just one representative of a community is maybe not, gonna be useful either, but that it's really, really ineffective. Like, we are not going to see, local scale conservation happening just based off of policy being made. Like, I'm sure they're going to come out. We'll see probably at the end of the week or next week some kind of policy ideas emerging from, or some kind of a, global statement emerging from the work that's happening right now in Cali, in Colombia. But, what happens then when that starts to actually get translated, down kind of the hierarchy into the local area? And so I think we definitely found that those kinds of things, while at some level they're useful, they're not going to be, a strong solution. And Gabby, I don't know if you want to say anything else about the what's our kind of response? That's a really good and kind of, that's a $1 million question, I think, right there.
No, I think you're on point, Lily. Like, the conventional science, conventional policy is ineffective. I guess there is like some progress in integrating other ways of knowing, and this has been a call for a long time, yet it's only just recently being taken seriously, especially by funding agencies. Lily and I have been working in developing curriculum, so translating this into learning initiatives for funding agencies interested in truly capturing local voices. I guess that would be my contribution to your answer, Lily.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that we see how difficult this is, and especially this was where I think, power really comes into play as well, and we see the interplay as well in the global north, global south, the way that, capital, like, we're not even here talking about, the role of capital, the role of big projects, like REDD+, other types of, conservation projects that are really imagined, often from the global north. And even in Chile, we saw and experienced a lot of the conflict that's going on over, the Nature Conservancy's work in Chile, and what it means to produce or reproduce a very globally north vision of conservation, which is often, one in which users are excluded. Tourism might become kind of the thing that it's more oriented around. Local voices are often excluded. These zones really then begin to, function with a logic of exclusion, nature for nature's sake, or the wildness. And I don't want to, no offense to the Nature Conservancy, because I do think it's important to have these NGOs, but we do see the kinds of issues that occur when we reproduce certain ideas, like, American style national park idea into, other parts of the world and the Western Hemisphere. So those kinds of things are, important as well. And then how do you resist, large scale capital, which that itself, brings a lot of power, and when people are talking with money. But then even those investments of money we see, fail often. I'm sure Joel can speak to that as well. And those who've done a lot of work with REDD+, the positive, and also many of the negative outcomes that we've seen. Any last questions, or I don't know if we can also turn it around if anybody here in the room has, thought about how science can be more inclusive of different knowledge and value systems, or, if others have seen issues of power, plurality, or conflict arising in their, work in the Latin American context or in global environmental change context, and how others might be thinking about these issues that we find in many of these projects.
Thank you, Lily and Gabriela. I have two questions, but I'll keep it at one, so maybe we have time for other people to also ask their questions. You talked about unlearning, and I think that's super interesting, and I experience it constantly, challenging the way your brain is wired to work. But I wonder, do you think it's necessary to learn to unlearn or not? Yeah. I don't know if I can be a little more precise with that. Yeah.
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is necessary. And I think that what is exciting is that you find creative ways of rethinking or reframing the way you approach your work, I guess. Was that helpful?
I was wondering more, do you need to go through, scientific training to be able to understand the limitations of scientific training and adopt a critical perspective that then allows you to go beyond it? Like, can you do that without the original training?
Well, I'll say I found, part of, I'll just say for a minute, even our internal team structure is that, I'm a geographer, environmental kind of science person. And actually Gabriela is in education. She's in the School of Education at University of Calgary, and really brought some interesting frameworks, to this, to our thinking on this, from ideas of, say, social learning, and these ideas of how we learn or unlearn things, which I had never really thought much about. I mean, I would, thought about things through a critical kind of theory lens, but I hadn't really thought as much about the actual processes of how we learn, together in collective ways or in social kinds of situations, how we learn together in a team setting, or even how we learn together with our community members and our partners. So I actually found it to be a really interesting and inspiring way to kind of turn that lens kind of back in a more self-reflective way, of, how the very processes of learning. And so that was work I hadn't really done before, kind of engaging in teamwork with Gabriela and some of these projects. So I guess the first thing I would say is I'd never really thought much about, how I necessarily, learned, and what that meant for the way I did research or came to research. And then, yeah, for the unlearning, I don't know if those who haven't gone through a lot of schooling, undergrad, then graduate, then PhD, kind of doctoral, like, you really do, it changes kind of how you think about things. So I don't know if those who haven't gone through that necessarily then need to unlearn, but I do think everybody in a project setting, or even in these settings where you're asking people to think about their values and their knowledge systems, it does help to do some kinds of exercises, thinking about learning and how, what people know, or how they know things, where their knowledge comes from. So I do think that work is really helpful and really does help people start to understand epistemology in a more grounded way. Because if you just walk into a room and you start saying epistemology, ontology, people are like, what? Like, but if you start to really think about, how do you know this to be true, whether that's the environmental problem that's happening or something like that, you'll start to see like, okay, there's very different methods through which, I know this through a very empirical data way, but this through a very like embodied or experiential way, or a way that's been, knowledge has been like passed down through these different structures. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying, but I do think, yeah, that kind of metacognition, reflective work is really important in whatever setting you can kind of do it. And it helps them with the plurality, I think, of people starting to see like, oh, there are so many ways of knowing, and one is not necessarily right, and one is not going to take us, to an effective endpoint, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, when's your time?
There's time.
Yeah.
Please. Good, very good though.
So I found it really encouraging that your conservation area was the watershed boundary, and I haven't seen a lot of that. I'm just wondering the advantages and the challenges to working at the watershed scale. But in my mind, that is a great unit to try to work on conservation issues.
Yes, thank you for that. I agree 100%. I mean, and I think many people have kind of thought about, environmental conservation, that, these political boundaries, social boundaries that we impose actually often make for really bad management decisions when we think about them from, like a political boundary standpoint, rather than a more natural kind of ecosystem boundary like a watershed. I think it opens a lot of opportunities to rethink our areas as watersheds, and of thinking of them of, what types of activities are happening, who's living at different, areas, where is demand for resources coming from, or what does it mean, to site a mega mine at the, headwaters of a watershed that's then, serving communities all along it. And things like that, rather than just thinking, oh, this city is, here, and we're only thinking about the boundaries of the city and not thinking like, where's all the pollution or heavy metals or different things coming from. And it also opens, I think, a lot of, or can provide a lot of challenges thinking that way, because many policymakers don't think that way, or even managers don't think that way. And so I would say getting policy to be made or enforced or even considered at the watershed scale remains, I've seen very little of that in the US context, and then definitely beyond of that actually being taken seriously when you're then talking to, a policymaker or even a manager. So I think then it becomes, the same problem we're having of translating policy down to a local level. There can also be a real problem with translating solutions that might emerge from the local level up to those who then have that power to, make the policy decisions or enforce, things that are happening. That, I don't know, Gabby, if you have any other thoughts on that question of the watershed scale.
No, I think the practices, it's like who uses what and who owns what, I guess, especially for children.
But yeah, in all three cases though, and then I mean in Colombia too, I think like, yeah, but.
We're at time, but I was wondering if I could sneak in one quick question, which is just, well, first of all, thank you so much. This is awesome and super informative, and I'm really excited to read the whole book. I haven't had time to do it yet, but honestly, like very excited about the work. I have several questions, but one is like, what do you see as the priorities for transdisciplinary training in academia for students and like moving forward? So like, based on lessons learned here, and also thinking about like the educational kind of focus and the curricular development work that y'all are doing right now, like what do you think are like some big priorities there?
¿Qué piensas, Gabby? I know we've been making this this curriculum, though not for university, more for people who want to write grants, but.
Well, we should share, there should be a way to make that accessible. Like as Lily was mentioning, we develop a curriculum, really excited about developing it, like really putting into practice or actually like articulating these learnings. And then I would say, I was just thinking about the first question, like the question around like, how do we learn to unlearn? And I think it's, it's all the way to how do we do research? And this applies in every discipline. It's like the ethical consideration of, reflexivity, researcher positionality and being very, I guess, paying attention to how we train students to ask questions, who benefits, for whom, how do you know what you know? And that links to, wait a second, who said that? And then move to, perhaps thinking that scientific research done in universities is only one way, a protocol, in fact, not the only one. I would say that we actually worked a lot on, reviewing these approaches to transdisciplinarity from an epistemological stance. So what does it mean as a way of living and versus, very instrumental, perhaps, approaches to doing the work. And then the other thing is, also we have been very emphatic in doing work across disciplines and across affiliations, intellectual affiliations. So you're asking a question that perhaps has been asked before from a different perspective, and that enriches your
Yeah.
I think
And
that
I'm sorry, Gabby. I was just gonna say at the university level, I mean, even in we've found and thinking with funding, that there's still a lot of gaps. Even if you're teaching about how to do transdisciplinarity, there become a lot of pragmatic issues that arise that can really make these projects challenging. And a lot of that, and this is something we've been thinking about a lot as we've developed this course that will end up being like an open access kind of MOOC when it's in its final, it's kind of in its beta phase right now. But how do you do community engagement? And especially coming from like universities or from funders, how do you actually, if we want to move community engagement to really empowering, or even community science, to really empowering communities to co-construct research questions, co-construct methodologies, come up as well with, tell you what their hypotheses are, or really work together in this way that kind of decenters academia as being kind of overly prescriptive in many cases. How do you actually even get the resources to communities? Because we found that, even managing grant money, and even with funders like the IAI or Belmont Forum that are really have thought deeply about this, it's still very, very hard to to distribute resources into the hands of communities, to take it out of this model of all of the money goes into the school's bank account, and then there are these like increasingly bureaucratic and difficult ways of ever being able to spend money, let alone send money into communities to do work. So that's another issue, I think, as we're, thinking about this. There's the silos in our own universities, definitely in mine, between different disciplines and colleges, even getting those kinds of things together. And then there's really just how these, processes work in a real world. That also makes that really challenging. So I think there's a pragmatic side as well to this, and how are we going to kind of change from the funder to the institution managing the funds, to the community level, if we're going to actually empower communities. So that's something we've struggled a lot with. Continue to struggle.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, that all resonates a lot, and it gives us a lot
I'm sure
as well. No, I mean it's the reality, it's a challenge for sure. But it's, working with and through those things, I think, is important, and thinking about experiences across different geographies and places is also super important.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to connect and kind of to meet everybody on your side, and maybe there'll be future opportunities as well to kind of think across kind of our teams and centers, and continuing this kind of work with similar goals of doing transdisciplinary research for kind of the wicked environmental sustainability, global environmental challenges that seem like we're going to be facing quite significantly here in this decade and beyond.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, everybody. It's so wonderful to learn more and to hear from y'all.
yeah, it was really nice to have also so many participation in the online room.
Yeah.
So thank you all.
Yeah. Gracias, Jorge and Fanny. Thank you so much as well for coming in.
Gracias, Jorge.
Thank you.
Ciao.
All right.
Chao.
Ciao.
Gusto, Jorge.
Chao.
It's so hard.
Thank you so much.